All Happy Inventor videos are for educational purposes only. Welcome to another episode of the Happy Inventor. Today we are going to be starting a series on the different aspects of the Wagner cylinder, or what I like to call the world station. And remember that several critical functions need to be achieved by any space station. And we're going to be going over those in the next few episodes to give a little bit more detail, because the numbers involved are important. The numbers decide whether something is actually possible or not possible. For example, why don't we have stations on the moon? Well, it costs too much. It's just too expensive to even make practical sense, and so it never happens. However, with SpaceX and their Starship, we're possibly going to reduce the costs of getting into orbit by 100 or 200 times. Now this makes a big difference, and a lot of things become possible when that happens. There's also physics involved, and sometimes the physics just make it impossible to do certain things. However, what we're working with doesn't seem to have very many limitations, but we're going to look at some limitations of the size of the Wagner cylinder. How big can we actually make it? Right now it's at 10,000 meters by 60,000 meters. It's huge by any standards, but material science allows us to go much larger without even going to nanotube technology, which would be extremely expensive. Besides that, I'm also going to be covering radiation shielding and how to optimize that, and to reduce the cost and mass of that radiation shielding, while at the same time lowering the tonnage per person that is required for the space station. We're also going to be looking at life support systems and electrical power, and seeing, does it make sense to have such a large space station when you consider the electrical power requirements and the life support system requirements? And even more importantly, what is the thermal radiating need for a particular space station? I've already mentioned that getting rid of heat in a large space station is a much bigger problem than trying to heat the space station, because just the amount of energy used on computers and lighting tend to heat the space station up, and it can't get rid of it. So you have to have radiators. So we're going to be looking also at that to see how much radiator space do we actually need for a particular space station to make it viable. So all these things, we're going to look at the numbers to make sure that the numbers actually work out and make sense for a particular space station. And it's going to take several episodes to do that. And I'm going to keep the number of the episode the same for all these episodes, but I'm going to change the lettering at the end. So we're going to go A, B, C, D, E, and continue on however long we have to go to get through all the different critical systems for the Wagner station. All right, let's go ahead and get started, and we're going to start out with looking at how big can we make a Wagner space station, and also how can we optimize it for the least tonnage. And so that's involving size, and so we're going to play with a number of different sizes for the space station and just see how the numbers change and evolve for developing the system and station that we actually want. Here we see the Wagner calculation sheet version 3.84, which I have been editing the equations and checking them to see if there were any errors. And I found out that actually this number for the thickness of the outer shell was calculated with the assumption that all the flooring and all the furnishings inside the outer torus had collapsed and landed on the outer shell. And so the outer shell not only had to support itself and the shielding, but also all the flooring and the furnishings that were above it. And what that does is increases this thickness, because the outer shell has to be stronger to support all that weight and still provide a safety margin of 3. Now this is overkill, because even if we didn't take into account the weight of those floors and used a margin of 3, if all the floors fell onto the outer shell, we would still have about a safety margin of 2, which means you'd still have about 2 times as much strength before you even reach the yield strength of the metal or the material of the outer shell. But even after that, you have another 20 to 30% of strength increase as you go beyond the yield strength before the material would actually collapse. So this is overkill, and what I've done is made another spreadsheet where I have removed that assumption. And this spreadsheet is version 3.85, and as you can see, the thickness of the outer shell has dropped by a little over 25%, reducing the actual amount of material we need. And where before we had 16 tons of shielding, now we're down to a little over 12 tons of shielding, which is plenty of shielding to even go into deep space. Now we can also reduce that by simply getting rid of some of our shielding here. And let's just get rid of that water shielding. And that takes us down to 10 tons. And essentially we are back to sort of the optimal amount of shielding. Of course, it's nice to have a little bit of water shielding to catch any stray neutrons, because steel does tend to spew out neutrons when hit by cosmic rays. So a little bit of water there might be good. We're back up to 11, but look, we're at 18 tons per person. We're under $2 million per condo, 2,000 square foot condos, which is probably a very reasonable price. But notice that this number here assumes that you're going into low Earth orbit. If you're going to an L4 or L5 location, which is actually the optimal place to put these space stations, they would be close to Earth, but you would have sun beating down on your solar panels 24 hours a day. So you don't need batteries and things like that to provide continuous power. Now, other places this could be, it could be in orbit around the sun, or it could be in an L4, L5 location with respect to the sun-Earth combination. And the reason we want to be in free space is the 24-hour solar energy that we can collect. If we're around the Earth, we can at best hope for about 2/3 of the time having solar power and 1/3 of the time being in the shadow of the Earth. And that would occur at about 600 miles above the Earth's surface. So what happens if we go to a slightly less dense material? For example, we might not want to stick with this 2800 merging steel and go for S-glass laminate, which would reduce this number, its strength, but it's only by a little bit, but its density is going to decrease by a lot. And so what happens is the thickness not only decreases because there's less mass, but also the flooring and the other inner shells have also used that lighter material. And the problem is now is that we're actually down under 4 tons per square meter of shielding. And to fix that, we could always add some more water. That gets it up there, but that's still not quite there. There's only at 6 tons. But we could actually add like a steel exterior like that, and it would actually protect the fiberglass or glass laminate material. And if we do that, that extra steel, 1/2 meter of steel, kicks us back up to about 10 tons, and we're back to good radiation shielding for deep space outside the Earth's low Earth orbit. If you're in low Earth orbit, you don't need that much. And so even with glass laminate, we can do it if we have enough shielding. Now, if the size of the space station is not this huge size, and for example, let's go down to 7 kilometers, all of a sudden we see that the thickness has decreased significantly. We've lost a little bit of our mass because the outer shell is not the majority of the mass of the space station, but we are a little under 10 tons now, and we might want to add just a little bit of water to it, say add another 1/2 meter water. We have a really nice swimming pool at the bottom layer of our space station, and that kicks us back up over 10 tons, provides really good neutron absorption. 3.5 meters of water would absorb a lot of thermal neutrons coming off of that large amount of steel that we have here, and also from the fiberglass and resin. Notice that the thicknesses of the inner layers have gone down too, and our total tons per person, we're edging towards 10 tons per person, which is very low. And look at our costs. It's only $1.3 million there. That is coming down. If you're enjoying this video, please hit the like and subscribe buttons right now. This way you won't miss any of the future content on these subjects. And now, back to inventing. Now let's see how large we can go with the space station. We know we can do 10 kilometers in diameter because we've seen that before, and with S-glass laminate we really don't need that thick of a layer for the outer shell to support everything. And in fact, we have too much shielding here. And I am going to just drop the water shielding down to 1 meter. And that reduces the thickness of the shell even further. And look at this, we're down in the tens of tons for the space station. Very inexpensive. We're getting close to $1 million for each person's condo. And we haven't even gone past 10,000. Let's try 20,000 kilometers. We'll just double it and see if that becomes a problem. And it really doesn't do too much. It's almost 3 meters thick now, but we're still at 13, 14 tons per person. But as we're thickening and making the space station larger, the mass of the outer shell is starting to require more outer shell just to support the outer shell. And so it becomes exponential, and at some point the mass will just exponentially grow and it will no longer be able to support itself with a reasonable thickness. And I want to see where that is. So we're going to go to 30 kilometers in diameter, and now we're at 5 meters thick. It's getting worse and worse. That's 50 kilometers. And at 50 kilometers, everything breaks down. So somewhere around 45 kilometers, or somewhere around 40, it's all at 40 kilometers, things just kind of break down. As you can see, oh yeah, see at 40 kilometers, we are at 8 meters thick. So that's getting too thick and it's just going to start failing. And look at our tons per person. Way too much, way too much. So let's go back down to a reasonable size that would still have somewhere around 10 tons per person. And at 15 kilometers in diameter, we're getting there. We're at 12 tons per person. We've got quite a thickness of the shell, and this S-glass laminate has a lot of hydrogen in it, so it is actually absorbing neutrons pretty well also. And so this steel that's here is going to spew out some neutrons, but this laminate should absorb most of that, and we may not need the entire 1 meter of water or polyethylene. And I'm just going to cut that down to a half a meter and see what that does. It didn't really affect too many things here. It's still under 12 tons per person, and we're under 2 meters for the thickness of the outer shell. And that's probably a reasonable size to have for the mass not becoming outrageous because of the outer shell starting to have to be thicker just to support itself. Let's take a look at 20,000 just again to see. And that doesn't add a lot to the tons per person, but it is increasing the price by about $250,000. So look how many people we have, 32 billion people. That's not going to work, is it? So let's go back down to 15 kilometers, and we are going to make it into a disc instead of this big huge cylinder so that we can have just a single one and it will be stable when it rotates. And to do that, we're probably going to have to make this 10,000 or less, 10 kilometers. And that does increase the mass per person, so that's not good. The thickness of the outer shell is staying the same. And we got very good shielding here. We got 9 tons, but we've got a lot of neutron absorbing material. We got almost 2 meters of it here, and we've got another half meter here. And we've got steel also absorbing the cosmic rays. So definitely increases the cost per person by going to a disc, but you don't have to have 2 rotating stations that are counter-rotating to balance out their momentum. So that potentially could be cheaper to do. And we're at 3 billion people, which is still a lot of people. But look at our rotation rate. We're at almost a third of an RPM, so we're going almost 3 times slower than the second hand on a clock, which is really pretty slow. It's slow enough that no one is going to even be able to detect that there's something wrong with the momentum and rotation of the space that they're living in. I think that's slow enough that most people are not ever going to be able to detect it, even if they're turning their head quickly, changing directions and doing things like that. So there's an example of how large we can go. I just wanted to show you those numbers, but I think in the next episode we're going to look at the increase in costs for sending the station out to an L4, L5, because the Starship, while this 50,000 is for reaching low Earth orbit, to actually get the Starship and its payload to L4, L5 is going to take about 5 refuelings. So in other words, we're going to need 6 launches to actually get a single payload to the L4, L5. And what that does is increase our cost by 6 times. And so now, instead of looking at just $1.5 million, we are looking at close to $10 million per person for their 2,000 square foot condo. And so that could be a problem, but there is a solution to that. And in the next episode, I'm going to discuss that solution, how we can cut this number in half and still get the space station out to L4, L5. All right, until next time, keep inventing.